Okay, we're recording.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Heidi Bulyoung. I'm a senior librarian at the Pikes Peak Library District. With me, I have Melissa Mitchell. She is my colleague, also a senior librarian at the Pikes Peak Library District. And this evening, we're presenting a community conversation on evictions. Joining us, our panel members, we have Catherine Duarte, the senior analyst, the Community Development Division of the City of Colorado Springs, and Kinsey Hetstedt, State and Local Policy Director, Enterprise Community Partners. So thank you both for being with us this evening. So our community conversations started in 2020, and our goal was to launch this new series of monthly events that invites the public to discuss current events and issues impacting the Pikes Peak region. We want to promote civil dialogue and a greater understanding of different perspectives. This evening's conversation on evictions. Here's a little bit of a background for that. So eviction filings in Colorado have risen significantly in the last few months after the state moratorium expired on January 1st. The CDC has extended the federal moratorium until June 30th. El Paso County has had over 500 eviction proceedings filed in January and February, while there had only been 100 or so proceedings in the past 2 months. We have invited a panel here to discuss the current state of evictions, the overall impact of evictions, and resources or programs designed to help prevent evictions. So welcome to our panel. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
We'll start off with this question. Sometimes when we talk about housing issues, we hear about many landlords beholden to their mortgages and banks, and that this crisis is all a part of a larger system. Could you share who should be involved in the eviction issues and whose responsibility it is to ensure that there isn't a wave of evictions? And either one of you can start.
I can start if that's okay. I think the first thing is just, making it very clear that the lease is a private agreement between renter and landlord. So both parties, anytime you have an agreement, all parties in the agreement are responsible for what they promise to do in the lease or not to do in the lease. So I think the bare minimum for renters is just to get, always read the lease, always know what they're signing on to. Same with landlords, agreeing to abide by anything that's in the agreement and not taking advantage of any renters who they suspect might not know what's in the agreement. But with that said, government, local, state, federal government plays a big part in understanding how the tool of eviction is used, making sure that there aren't significant power imbalances that adversely affect our most vulnerable households. We also need to know, we need to understand the patterns, like I said, how it's used and whether it is used to, whether the use of eviction negatively affects the housing crisis that we're in and that we've been in before, although this one feels a little different. And signs are looking as if eviction is definitely making a dent in this housing market for a lot of households. We also need to understand whether this tool of eviction is applied in a discriminatory way. And we don't have a lot of data supporting that. So that's something that I would like to see more of, is more transparency in data collection behind eviction. So I guess the short answer is we're all a part of this. We all bear some responsibility for understanding and preventing eviction.
Thanks for going first, Catherine. And I couldn't agree more with everything that you said. I was considering this question, preparing for this evening, and one of the points that I arrived to had to do with power as well, and really thinking through, I think that it comes down to entities and individuals at different points along this broader system that we are all operating in. The people and the organizations that have power have an opportunity and a responsibility to provide, particularly in this time of COVID and this unprecedented period of housing instability, to provide grace and to provide resources to folks who are subject to those decisions of the people and the entities in power. And I think we are seeing some of that, flow throughout. So to the point of the question, the federal government and mortgage lenders have provided the opportunity for forbearance on mortgages for a lot of single family homeowners and owners of multifamily properties. So these folks who have mortgages with that are backed by Fannie or Freddie or HUD have the option, if they are suffering economically, to delay mortgage payments. And those forbearance periods and opportunities keep getting extended as the pandemic continues. And so I certainly think that mortgage lenders and banks with considerable power and financial resources have the opportunity to provide for the folks who they have power over, frankly, through those leases and those contractual agreements. And then I think it's, again, the opportunity and responsibility of those property owners and landlords to pass along the same opportunity as they are able and resources to folks who may rent units in multifamily buildings or are renting single family homes, particularly for folks who have been negatively economically impacted by the pandemic. And as Catherine very rightly stated, the evidence we have is, of course, that BIPOC communities, lower income and fixed income communities are really suffering disproportionately from the pandemic, both health consequences and economic ones. These are also the data that we do have show that folks and households of color, particularly women of color and particularly families, and again, our lowest income community members are those who are most at risk for eviction, even when we're not in a pandemic. And so when you bring all of those risk factors together through the pandemic, I think that we, as Catherine was saying, have a responsibility to provide resources and grace, particularly for the most marginalized and vulnerable among us. And so it kind of passes down through this system and power structure that we all exist in for responsibility to help prevent a wave of evictions. And I do really want to underscore too the point of the role of policymakers at federal, state, and local levels. I think when we get to talking about the most vulnerable and folks who may be more subject to not having good actors in those positions of power, it is incumbent upon policymakers to provide for those situations and those individuals by issuing things like eviction moratoria, like the CDC has done. The state legislature is considering reinstating another state-specific eviction moratorium, providing funds. The federal government has finally come through with considerable rental assistance, and so the state needs to be getting that money out the door and into the hands of tenants and landlords in an expeditious manner. So it does fall on this broad system, but everybody has their role to play. And I really would like to underscore too the point about the lack of transparency in eviction, particularly within Colorado. There's a lot of data like nationwide or from other cities and states, but Colorado really does a poor job of tracking not even just the numbers of eviction filings, but especially any kind of information on who is most impacted within our state, whether it's by geography or income or race. And so we would totally agree that there's a really big opportunity and need for greater transparency and consistency in reporting to better understand who's most affected and how to target policies and programs.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both for your answers. Now, it seems like a lot of COVID-19 discussion now is focused on, returning to a new normal or returning to normal or pre-COVID-19 ways of life. But people were getting evicted and there were housing inequities before COVID-19. So what does a future of normal look like to you?
Since Catherine was brave to go first last time, I'll be brave this time. So again, one of the notes I had made under here was the need for better data and transparency to understand who's most affected by eviction in the state of Colorado and how we can help prevent that most effectively. So I truly believe that that is one thing we need to do. You know, I looked up the data that does exist. So every fiscal year, the state judicial department puts out, you know, numbers and data on the total number of eviction filings in county courts, which is where most residential evictions are filed. And in the fiscal year of 2019, there were over 38,000 eviction filings throughout the state's county courts. And collectively, that comprised 27% of all civil cases brought in the state of Colorado. Thank you, Catherine. And I once heard someone in a policy discussion about evictions and how to prevent them state that it is just a fact of life that there will be about or upwards of 30,000 evictions in the state of Colorado every year. And I was really struck by that acceptance of that as a normal, rather than contemplating that that is a huge number of eviction filings. We don't know how they resolved, but that's a huge amount of county court resources, not to mention the very real lives who are impacted every time an eviction is filed. And so I would certainly hope that a new normal would look nothing like the vast numbers of evictions that are filed every year in the state. And in fact, that we are making strides to understand and prevent those evictions. And as we started discussing here already this evening, eviction is certainly an equity issue. It disproportionately harms folks who are lower or fixed income, again, women of color, especially mothers. And so I think that there is a lot that we can do to, both within the housing system and so many other things, to help prevent evictions, particularly for folks who've been systemically marginalized. I think we need a better balance in our view of legal protections between landlords and tenants. I believe that state law currently skews toward landlords in Colorado. There have been some strides toward better tenant protections in recent years, but I think we have lots of work to do. I think we need to develop much more affordable housing and supportive housing to keep folks who are at greatest risk of eviction housed. There are opportunities coming out of all of these federal funds, like the American Rescue Plan Act, the new infrastructure package coming down, to provide for big kind of once in a lifetime infusions into housing development, shallow rent subsidies, all these kinds of things that could help us return to a different and new normal that sees more Coloradans stably housed and having the services they need.
Well, very well put, Kinsey. I don't want to go back to the normal. I reject the normal pre-COVID, the eviction landscape. Looking at a more local level, I always run to the Colorado Judicial Branch annual report every time it comes out. And 2020, the year of the pandemic, there were still over 4,000 evictions in El Paso County. That's over 12 households a day during an unprecedented public health emergency. But the year before that, it was over 6,715 evictions in El Paso County, over 18 households a day. And well, people in my field tend to look at the costs, the public costs, the private costs. I also feel very deeply for the very personal cost that evictions have on families and your finances. It's basically a permanent stain on your record, and it makes it nearly impossible to rebuild your credit in a timely way, to recoup the money that was lost during the eviction process, and just the trauma of being displaced, and changing schools, things like that. But on a financial level, I think we really need to rethink how we use as a tool. So I think as we get back to a new normal, I really hope that we can, after the infusion of federal funds that Kinsey just alluded to, incredible infusion of CDBG, ESG funding, home money for both capital projects and very emergency, very temporary emergency rental assistance through the Treasury. Hopefully that buys us enough time to keep people housed while we think about more sustainable, kind of humane tools to keep people housed. Eviction is definitely a tool that we shouldn't, that exists for a reason, but it should be incredibly rare and harder, basically harder to do, just given how much other external pressures are put on low-income families. I think we can put our heads together and come up with some different policy tools, both on the housing side, the local government side, and service provider side.
Great, thank you both. And it looks like Laura has been able to join us from the Apartment Association. Hi, Laura.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Good.
We're right in the middle of a few questions, so I'm going to present to you the question that Kinsey and Catherine both just answered. So it seems like a lot of COVID-19 discussion now is focused on returning to normal or pre-COVID-19 ways of life. But people were getting evicted and there were housing inequities before COVID-19. So what does a future normal look like to you?
Well, I mean, from our point of view, I know that as Catherine said, eviction is never good for anybody. Unfortunately, there are a variety of reasons why people get evicted, aside from the financial ones. As far as the financial ones go, we actually see it as being more positive than it was pre-COVID. I would say that there's a lot more funding. Pre-COVID, there was very little eviction prevention dollars, and now there's been really phenomenal amounts of money put towards that. I think where the struggle lies is trying to get the information out to people and let them know where it exists and how to get it, and helping them get the documents together. That's a big struggle for some folks. Just trying to figure out how to get the documents they need to the right place, and that's been a big issue. But I think as far as funding goes, I think the new normal looks far better than it did pre-COVID.
Thank you. And we will pose the next question and we'll let Laura start the round of answers. What does eviction or homelessness prevention look like in our community?
Well, I actually serve on the COC board, so we deal primarily with homelessness. Eviction prevention, I think a lot of that is just information. I think when people get behind, especially with COVID, and especially the worst hit industries, the folks that actually lost their job or became very ill, I think the key is going to be getting them that information and making sure that the level of funding that's needed is going to be available long term. So that's, as far as the eviction prevention goes, I think the key is information is going to be really key, because I do think the money is there. The funding is available in a variety of forms, but getting it to the right people and communicating to them what they're going to need to get that help can be difficult sometimes, especially if they're, going on, experiencing other types of trauma. As far as homelessness is concerned, I mean, unfortunately, our homeless find themselves in a very tight market. Really, we need more housing of all kinds as quickly as we can in a variety of price ranges. And that's not an easy fix, obviously. Material costs are going up every day, land costs are going up every day, labor is high. So that's going to be a long-term fix. One of the other issues is that I think job training, financial training, so that people can avoid being evicted or avoid sort of some of the difficulties that some of them struggle with. And then mental health, I think, is a huge one for the homeless. I don't think we have near enough mental health resources in our community, and I think that would go a long way.
You can go next. I know that we've alluded to a lot of an infusion of federal and state dollars during over the last year. Right now, the landscape of homelessness and eviction prevention is very robust. My worry is that these are this is only buying us a little bit of time. But for the time being, Laura's absolutely right. We do need to get the word out because this is kind of an unprecedented level of funding across across the board. Prior to COVID, we had maybe one eviction prevention pilot program that started with Greshio Housing among their own properties, but then it expanded to any renter who qualified. Post-COVID, we now have a few different versions, a few different programs like that. We've got Greshio, which offers up to 3 months. I don't want to misspeak, but a few months of rental assistance for families who are who've experienced some sort of shock, either loss of a job, death in the family, mental health crisis. Catholic Charities has taken on a ton of the state and federal funding to help families, to keep families housed. And that's for both folks who are trying to stay in their homes and for folks who have lost their homes and are looking for to be rapidly rehoused. Family Promise has started a homeless prevention program for families who are on the verge of losing their home, either through an eviction notice or job loss. And then, of course, the City of Colorado Springs, through the appropriations bill of December of last year, we received $14 million for local renters who make below, who income qualify, who make below 80% of the AMI for the Colorado Springs MSA. It is for them to pay rental arrears, utility assistance, any sort of late fees. It even includes things like trash and internet, all the different fees that are itemized in your lease, and it's helping people get caught up, and then pays up to 3 months rent, so that it buys them a little bit of stability. But again, my worry is that this is buying us a little bit of time, but a lot of industries haven't fully come back to being fully operational, and the wages definitely aren't going up. So yeah, that goes back to what will the new normal look like? Right now, we're doing our best to get the word out about these resources, and I can get you links, Heidi and Melissa, to those programs. But that's my spiel.
Thank you both. I think this is another great question. My boss, Jenny Rogers, had the opportunity to serve on a governor-appointed task force last fall, a special eviction prevention task force that convened about 10 members from different parts of the housing industry to discuss and make recommendations to Governor Polis, upon which he acted on some of those policy recommendations to help prevent eviction, both in this unprecedented public health crisis moment, but also more long-term. And some of the priorities that we at Enterprise had identified going into that to help prevent eviction that I think work now, but also, as both Catherine and Laura have said, we need to be thinking much more longer term, are providing some clear legal protections for Coloradans, particularly in a time of COVID, for those who've been negatively impacted, in finding ways to ensure that no tenant who is eligible for rental assistance is evicted. And I think this comes back to some of what Laura was saying. There certainly are funds, the most recent COVID package from December allocated $285 billion across the country in emergency rental assistance. Colorado, as a collective between the state and local governments, received about $385 million. but we need time to be able to get that money into the hands of landlords and into the hands of tenants. And so I think that there are things to do there to pair the availability of rental assistance with ensuring that tenants who are on the verge of eviction, because they've lost their job, they've wound up with medical bills because of COVID, or otherwise, have the time to actually apply for and get those funds. And I would actually offer that we should be thinking about how to make that application process more streamlined. And I think, again, Laura was totally right that there's a huge burden for many tenants in gathering necessary documentation and submitting it. And there are so many community navigators who are doing truly incredible work helping folks to navigate those systems. But the less burdensome we can make those processes, the more efficient I think we can be in getting those dollars into the hands of folks who need them. We also really want to and need to be supporting landlords' capacity to maintain safe, stable, and healthy housing for their tenants. Again, pairing legal protections with funds and getting those into the hands of folks. I think thinking to the homelessness piece, if an eviction does occur or someone loses their house or home, tenants need to be protected and rehoused after an eviction is initiated, preferably, before a person or a family gets to the point of actually experiencing homelessness and needing to rely on the shelter system within our state. Really investing in those rehousing resources and trying to connect folks, both who are, perhaps being threatened with eviction or on the verge of it, and finding ways mostly to stay housed in their current home and avoid the harms of that displacement that Catherine was talking about earlier, but also really thinking about how we can be investing funds and creating systems that help kind of catch folks and help them become rehoused. And then again, the need to kind of track eviction data and resource allocation, particularly in this time with all of these funds, trying to track where they're going and who they're going to. And then following that through, I think, and understanding the impact of potential future evictions on even folks who received resources and identifying gaps in our systems where we could perhaps do better. I want to come back. One thing that was mentioned was the need to develop housing on all parts of the housing spectrum. And I think that's true, but really do want to focus on the need and the gap that exists for folks who are extremely low income in this state, because often those are folks most at risk of eviction for rent being overdue. The National Low Income Housing Coalition puts out a report every year called The Gap that looks at the gap in available affordable housing in every state between the need and what's available. And for 2020, Colorado ranks among the worst states for having the necessary affordable housing for folks who are extremely low income. I pulled up their site, I can drop it into the chat, but just their very top line data is that there are only, as of 2020, there were only 30 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low income renter households in the state. And 3/4 of extremely low income renter households in Colorado are severely cost burdened, meaning that they are spending more than half of their income on housing. And these are extraordinary numbers. And there's a lot that we can do in addition to developing that truly affordable housing for folks in the lowest income thresholds. I think the mention of kind of wraparound services for folks who experience homelessness, who have experienced homelessness chronically and kind of are cycling between the criminal justice system and homelessness, and maybe have mental health needs or experiencing substance use issues. I think there's the idea of permanent supportive housing and housing that really invests in a housing first model where folks have a home and then are able to and have really significant and intense supportive services that are centered on the person and whatever their unique situation is to help keep them housed is really critical. Enterprise was proud to partner with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and the City of Denver over the last 5 years in something called a social impact bond, where investors basically helped to house some of the folks in the city who were most chronically kind of stuck in that cycle in an effort to demonstrate that investing in supportive housing is more cost efficient from the government perspective than having folks interact with the criminal justice system or have to seek healthcare from an emergency room. And over the course of the 5-year effort, which has just concluded, the outcome really was that folks who were involved in the program spent fewer days in jail or prisons, were able to stay stably housed longer, and there was a decrease in costs to governments. And so I think coming back to that idea and really investing in that kind of supportive housing and housing first model would be another good step toward helping to prevent homelessness in our communities.
Wonderful, thank you all. Now this might be a repeat, but what are some eviction prevention initiatives that are occurring in our community and or state right now? And then I know earlier we mentioned the problem of getting that information out to people that need it. Can you what can be done about that? How can we get that information out to the people that really truly need it?
I can mention that we will be approaching PPLD soon on hosting some workshops. We're working with Pikes Peak United Way on getting the word out and creating an equitable plan of communications for those who are at most risk of eviction, those who are most likely to have lost their job over the last, or a reduction in hours over the past year, and those who have also been traditionally left out of public assistance dollars. So yeah, this is a wide net. What we do know is data that we have from year after year is that most people who qualify for assistance don't even apply for it, let alone not receive it. They don't even apply. So with this kind of unprecedented infusion of public assistance for housing stability, it really is incumbent upon us with the local government and service providers to really get that word out. So PPLD can be expecting some some calls about hosting some mobile application hubs for those rental assistance dollars. And even though there is some overlap between this question and the last question, I neglected to mention a couple great resources. One, of course, is a plug for my division. In addition to the rental assistance dollars, some of the CDBG and ESG funding that we received, we're also investing in programs that we know work. We're using CDBG CV dollars, which are CARES Act funds, to invest in 2 years of funding a housing attorney with the Colorado Legal Services, Colorado Springs branch. And we know it works because one, it's better than nothing. What we know nationally is that only 4% of tenants facing eviction have legal representation versus something like 98% of landlords who have legal representation. So, but a study done for the Public Justice Center just last year, they studied the Baltimore City area, but they also looked at national data. And this was done by a investment banking and economic development firm called Stout. They found that for every dollar invested in right to counsel for low-income tenants, there's a cost savings or value of those services estimated at over $6.24. So that is a huge return on investment by just investing in prevention. And I don't have numbers for other preventative services, but so much of our CDBG funds go to preventative services like food security, addressing food security, counseling for families, mental health services. So I think we do need to rethink what eviction prevention looks like. It doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of rental assistance dollars. It can come in forms of other types of investments in health and well-being and education. But in terms of the legal tools, there's another resource that I neglected to mention, which is our own local Justice Center, which is the charitable arm of the El Paso County Bar Foundation. They have developed something called an eviction, Prevent Eviction Pikes Peak, and they've teamed up with some very creative service providers in the Colorado Springs and Denver areas to develop videos and trainings for tenants and landlords on just ways to prevent eviction. And that includes just how to communicate. A lot of times, you know, when we were talking about that power imbalance, tenants don't know how to communicate with their landlords, either because they're, you know, it's a very emotional relationship. So just kind of teaching tenants how, you know, how to put things in writing, communicate with them. And also, if you see an eviction coming, how to employ tools like rescission, which is coming to a mutually beneficial agreement, which is you getting out and leaving your credit and your record intact. And you don't have the, you know, just the financial stain of an eviction on your record. So I think there are a lot of really creative efforts underway, and I hope that we follow that momentum and follow a lot of the things that Kinsey was referring to in the Eviction Prevention Task Force. So I'll stop now.
I thought that was great, Catherine. Thank you. You know, I think in thinking about getting the word out, I'm sorry that our colleague from Brothers Redevelopment couldn't be here, because I know that they have partnered closely with the State Division of Housing. They're among a number of nonprofit partners throughout the state who have been partnering with DOH in order to get those rental assistance dollars out the door and let folks know that they're there. So I think, you know, there is a challenge in that there's a lot available and there is such a huge need. And a lot of these amazing community-based partners who are kind of serving in that intermediary role are just seeing huge degrees of demand. And their staff are working so hard. And I think that this year has just put such a strain on all of our communities in so many ways. But there certainly are a lot of organizations doing incredible work to get the word out. I think particularly to communities that face language barriers or technology barriers and kind of understanding and accessing all of these things, we've seen community navigators be really key. And so I think that is one thing that is pretty basic, but can certainly help ensure folks understanding of access to information and funding is just making things accessible to folks who speak different languages, have different needs. You know, I'm sure libraries making computers available. I think there are a lot of creative ways that folks who are trusted in their communities are getting the word out. There's also services and partners, which I guess is getting into a different question a bit, but like the Colorado Legal Services is out there as well, helping to represent folks who are facing eviction. There's a project that has sprung up through COVID called the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project. And they have a pretty innovative model of helping to administer rental assistance as well as providing legal services to folks facing eviction and some other wraparound services. So there are resources out there, like you say, and we've acknowledged just finding ways to meet the folks who need that help where they're at and getting it delivered to them by trusted messengers. Some of the, you know, being a policy person, when I was asked the question of some of the initiatives that are happening now, my mind went to some policy and funding pieces. So we've talked about the funding that's come from the federal government, just thinking through the policy pieces that have come. So the CDC does still have in effect an eviction moratorium for eligible tenants. It's not everyone, through June 30th. Governor Polis also just a day or two ago reinstated a protection he had put in place for most of last year and had fallen off at the end of 2020, which is a 30-day right to cure period. So this is under Colorado statute, there's a 10-day period required between a landlord between when a landlord first issues a notice of eviction and a tenant has 10 days to try to cure or repay the rent that is owed before the eviction can move forward. So the executive order that Governor Polis issued now re-extends that to 30 days because of the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID pandemic. And so now tenants do have longer to pay rent. And I think a lot of that is motivated by, again, the amount of time that it's taking to get funds for eligible folks into the hands of landlords and tenants. We do expect the legislature to take up consideration of a bill shortly here that would enact a state-specific eviction moratorium for a couple of months. Again, not for everyone, for eligible tenants, and then provide a kind of ramp off period from that eviction moratorium back into some of the before times, but to try to prevent that cliff of evictions that folks continue to worry about. And then there are a number of other bills being considered at the state legislature. One has already passed that I hope helps. And that's a bill that would enable undocumented folks to access state and local housing assistance funds. They have not previously been eligible for that. So the governor has signed this into law. So now undocumented folks can access those funds. And there was an amendment to the state budget that recently went through that would provide $5 million to the Division of Housing earmarked for people who are undocumented to be able to access and remain housed. There's another bill that's been introduced that would provide $15 million for a lot of different things, but including the ability to for grants to entities to buy hotels and motels to transition them into transitional housing for folks. That's been a model we've seen adopted in a lot of places throughout the state through COVID that's been successful. And we've heard experts say can provide some more of that stability for folks who are used to living unsheltered it can be quite a leap for folks who have been experiencing homelessness to jump from particularly living unsheltered into like an apartment or a home like that. And so these kind of intermediaries could also be good long-term solutions to helping folks transition into more stable housing. And then Senate Bill 173 is a contentious bill that is being debated at the state legislature, but seeks to provide more time for tenants to be able to, who fall behind in rent, to be able to repay that rent before being evicted or before realizing that eviction, and to provide a little more balance once an eviction gets into the court process between tenants and landlords. There's a lot of housing bills going on. And I think, again, other efforts to help folks in other parts of their life where, I think the phrase is rent eats first. So a lot of folks are making really difficult decisions between paying rent or paying medical bills or paying for food. And so other efforts that we're seeing to make health insurance more accessible, to provide, greater food equity and stability to families is also going to help folks stay stably housed.
The only thing I wanted to add, I think maybe that has been forgotten, is that managers and owners of rental properties have, from the beginning of COVID, assisted their residents in getting and applying for rental assistance. Obviously, many times with very little or no thank you. And, keep in mind that these properties take a full staff to run, and many of these staffs got hit with COVID as well, or their spouses got hit with COVID, or their family members were dying and needed care for, or their children weren't in school and they still had to find a way to help their residents stay housed, because definitely, a lot of the regulations and moratoriums and what have you that have been placed on the federal state level have actually resulted in, I guess, a little bit of good news in all of this, what feels like doom and gloom, I guess, is that the delinquency rate statewide is 2%. And throughout COVID, with all of this assistance, in many cases, the delinquency was better than it has been in previous years. So while there are folks, and in any tragic that will fall through the cracks, I just want to point out the fact that many managers and owners and management companies realtors, individual investors that have one single home, have worked very, very hard to make sure their residents had rental assistance, and in some cases were refused, and faced with a door, slammed saying, the law says I don't have to pay you any rent. So I just would want to point that out, that that there's a whole nother side, I think, of the community that has really stepped up during this whole time and done, I think, an incredible job alongside nonprofits and folks that kind of do this full time. This was added work, if you will, in many cases with short staffs and having to work from home, as in addition to everyone else. So just wanted to point that out.
That's a great point, Laura. And I'd like to jump in and say, just for whoever's watching this recording later, that landlords and property managers can apply for these rental assistance funds on behalf of their tenants. Of course, that doesn't address the issue that you were talking about, Laura, where some tenants don't want to deal with that. I imagine many would. So for all you property managers out there, the ERA, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program link that I just sent out in the chat on the Colorado DOLA page, that is open for landlords as well.
I do believe, and maybe Kinsey can clarify, but I do believe there is a tenant side of that has to be done by the tenant. And there has been a struggle, and that's part of the delay with the recent funds, is that part of it has to be done by the tenant. And if they can't get the documents, there is a big delay.
For both sides, whether you, whether you're a tenant or not, the other party needs to agree.
Right.
I don't know if that's the main source of the bottleneck, but it definitely seems like a logistical nightmare.
Right. And, I think a good thing to clarify, and maybe you probably have more information than anybody, Catherine, is that this new funding through what we're calling the ERAP program does have specific qualifications. I mean, they have to give bank accounts or taxes and prove an impact, where much of the other money that came from the state, as far as the POP program and the EHAP program, did not have as many qualifications or as stringent of rules, if you will. So I do know that on the local level, through Catholic Charities and some of the other nonprofits here in town, there is maybe less stringent funds available. So I just don't want people to get frustrated if for some reason they don't qualify for the ERAP at the state level.
Thank you. And there was a comment in the chat while Kinsey was speaking, and I'm not sure which program or assistance that Allison's referring to, but she asked if something is only for people over 62. And if Allison, if you want to type in the chat what you were referring to, then we can get an answer to your question.
Yeah, I'd be happy for more clarification if there was something specific. As far as I know, nothing I mentioned would be only for folks over age 62. But I don't want to lead you astray by not knowing exactly what I'm answering. But rental assistance funds that are available are not limited by age. There are income eligibility requirements, as Laura was saying. But I don't think anything I mentioned would be restricted by age.
Okay, and our last question of the evening is, and a little bit you've touched on about moratoriums being extended, but what will happen when the eviction moratoriums expire? Will tenants be forced to pay all of their back rent at once?
I can tell you from the landlord point of view, before all this funding was available, there were landlords who were working with their tenants to figure out extending their leases, to figure out how to use security deposits. Now that the funding has become available, Legally, it depends on, I'm sure there will be extensions, would be my guess, as the governor has done recently by, you know, he had stopped the 30-day notice. It went to a 10-day, and now the 30-day notice is back. And so there are mechanisms there that he has the ability to enact. Most people, as I said, statewide, we check on this monthly. There's a 2% delinquency rate. So it's a small number of folks that I believe are really, really struggling to find those resources. And it was my understanding that that was part of the reason that they had not extended the 30-day before, because there was plenty of funding available to cover those rents. So the only hole or gap that I can see is getting that information to the right people, getting them to do the forms and to get it in. The timing may get strained because, as you all know, we're working on a 13, 14-month situation here where honestly, there are people who have not paid rent in over a year. And those are going to be the cases that are going to be very, very tough to stop once those moratoriums are lifted. If in the event that resident has not made any, you know, hasn't taken any assistance or made any effort to cure some of the debt, that'll be a problem when those are lifted.
Yeah, I would be curious, Laura, if you're able to share the data showing just a 2% delinquency. I don't know if that's only among apartment association members, their experience, or if it's representative statewide. It's good to hear that it's relatively low, at least in some places. I did drop a link in the chat. The Division of Housing has put up a dashboard that shows weekly the number of applications for rental assistance or housing assistance. Most of them are rental assistance that the state has received and funds. And then there's a different page on there that shows the actual allocations to date. And it looks like the most recently that they updated it, I don't see the date quickly enough, but what I'm seeing right now is that there's been in excess of $170 million requested in rental assistance. And I know that the allocations are not keeping up with the demand, which is a significant reason, I believe, why the governor re-extended that right to cure period, because folks have fallen behind, and they're just, again, like we've been talking about, there's such challenges in trying to get it out the door. When I was looking at the Census Bureau's most recent pulse survey, which they've been doing throughout the pandemic, I may have done the proportions wrong, but their survey through the end of March said that renters reported, nearly 1 in 7 Colorado renters reported being behind on their rent. And nearly a quarter of Colorado renters had no or slight confidence that they would be able to pay April's rent, and a significant fear of losing their home to eviction. So I think that the threat is there, and I think no matter the scale, though the scale may be significant, we continue to talk about very real people's well-being and ability to stay stably housed, not now, but into the future. As Catherine mentioned at the beginning, an eviction can make it really challenging for someone to find housing in the future. And I certainly agree with Laura that at least as of right now, it's really going to depend on whether we see folks have to pay everything that they have owed all at once. I think that will depend on landlords. I think there's certainly, as she said, there's so many landlords who have been doing great work and working with tenants. We work closely with a lot of our nonprofit housing partners and public housing authorities who have been really trying hard to keep their residents housed and in community. And it'll depend on landlords' ability economically to keep folks in those places, and their relationship with tenants and tenants' relationship with their landlords. So I think there's a lot of it will depend. I think we'll see what the legislature decides to pass in the course of this session, providing tenant protections or landlord funding for rental assistance, in addition to what already exists, and see what that can do to help avoid this cliff as well.
Yeah, I can provide you, I mean, obviously the majority of people that answer our surveys are members of ours. I can tell you here locally, we represent about 70% of the rental market. So it is the largest chunk. Now there obviously can be those pockets that are possibly different than those that are members of ours. We also have data on the number of evictions compared to previous years, and obviously those evictions are way lower than they have been in the past. Even when some of the restrictions were lifted, there still wasn't there wasn't this tsunami, if you will, that we kept hearing about of evictions, because I think it's a win-win if the resident can stay in the unit. I mean, there is a high cost to the landlord as well in an eviction process. And if they can keep them housed, and there is that good, relationship, and they figure out some of the unique situations that they run into, then it's a win-win situation to keep them in the unit. But I will send those to Catherine. Unfortunately, I don't have access to them where I am right now, but I will send those over to you guys.
Yeah, I too do not have a crystal ball, but sorry, just blanked what the first resource I was going to mention was. It came out just as soon as I started talking, but I did want to speak to the dynamic that Laura mentioned about the delinquency rate. Back in November and December, our division released kind of a truncated version of the census's household survey, or household pulse survey. They ask a lot of questions about food security, mental health, ability to pay rent, job loss, income loss, but we just asked five different questions about